Greetings, Dr. Mark Winson here from the University of Central Florida, Department of Criminal Justice, and what I would like to do in this video is briefly address some of the situations that investigators face when interviewing a psychopathic suspect. And I'm going to draw mainly from Professor J. Quayle's 2008 article titled Interviewing a Psychopathic Suspect from the Journal of Investigative Psychology and Offender Profiling, Volume 5, pages 79 to 91. Now, we've already spent some time talking about the psychopathic personality, and some of those characteristics to review include being superficially charming, lying, being manipulative, being sexually promiscuous, demonstrating a lack of empathy, also having a lack of shame and remorse for damaging activities. And we also noted that the rate is estimated perhaps around 1% or so in the general population, and that psychopathy has a very early onset and is more likely to appear in males, and is also related to crimes and greater risk of recidivism. One of the things about psychopathy is that it tends to be a lifelong pattern because it's embedded in the personality. And we also talked about the actual Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, antisocial personality disorder, which was different from psychopathy. Although there's some shared characteristics, there certainly are differences as well. So that some of these ideas apply also to conducting interviews with those that would be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, sociopaths, and also those that would have the characteristics of psychopathy. In thinking about conducting the actual interview, Quayle points out some of the characteristics during an interview which one will want to be aware of and keep considering throughout the interview. Focus on some of the interpersonal characteristics, such as the superficial charm that the interviewee presents, also their sense of grandiosity, that they're going to possibly tell you about all the great things that they've done, how smart they are. They're also going to lie and manipulate during the interview. And looking at the affective characteristics, we see basically the lack of guilt, and also we'll see basically shallow presentation of feelings, and also the lack of empathy, and often they will not accept responsibility for the damages that they have caused with their behaviors. Also, we'll see some of the lifestyle aspects, for example, the need for stimulation in their life, of course, but also during the interview, and maybe poor impulse control as well. Some of the characteristics Quayle talks about that are unlikely to affect the interview behavior, but also we should keep in mind include things such as their parasitic lifestyle, their early problems, their irresponsibility, juvenile delinquency, their short-term relationships, and such. So some things are more relevant to keep in mind than others. But one thing that I think is important to remember that Quayle points out is that many people with psychopathy do not actually have contact with the criminal justice system, that many of those characteristics that are discussed may be actual benefits in business and industry and different occupations. And also that many of those characteristics, if you think about it, are not really directly related to criminal behavior. It depends on the situation. But if you go back and you think about, for example, is it a crime to be grandiose? Is it a crime to have shallow affect, to lack empathy, to be impulsive, to be sexually promiscuous? And so what we want to do is look at how the characteristics of the person we're interviewing is related to the possible crime or crimes that they committed. Of course, the recommendation, if you're qualified, or if you have a team approach, is to use one of the measurement tools. For example, the gold standard, I think, that was mentioned before is Professor Hare's Psychopathy Checklist Revised, the PCLR. And in order to use that measurement tool, one has to have specific training. Sometimes we'll see that there are some additional characteristics or behaviors that make an offense much more violent. We might see a sadistic dimension added on, or we might see more of a cold-blooded type behavior to reach a goal. And so we want to look at the extent of violence in each of the cases. Many of the interviewing characteristics that we've learned through our training may not apply directly in interviewing those with psychopathy. And so, for example, Quayle points out that establishing rapport may not be that beneficial. Letting, challenging the psychopath may not be that helpful. Acting friendly, patient, supportive may not be that relevant because they don't care. They don't care what you think about them. They don't care how you react. Now, they don't care that you think some of these activities that they've done are despicable or evil. They do want to show how smart they are, though, and how they can pull one over on the interviewee. So some of the interviewee behaviors that we may see that we need to address during the interview would include, for example, outwitting behaviors. That often the individual will try to intimidate the interviewer and take control of the interview and start asking questions or criticizing the questions. If I'm interviewing someone and I ask them a question, they say, that is really a stupid question. The initial reaction might be to get a little defensive or upset, but also there's the opportunity to reframe it. I would say, okay, I guess that is a stupid question. What would your suggestion be to make it better? So we want to play into that narcissism, to that ego, to that feeling superior, to get more information. So the interviewee enjoys being the focus of attention, especially if they're high in the area of narcissism. They may also use arrogance and grandiosity to try to intimidate the interviewer. And if we were to confront them about discrepancies in their statements, they would just blow them off and say, well, these, they'd ignore, wouldn't really care too much. They may also try to shock the interviewer to get a response. Talking about something that they did. And they may insult the interviewer. Sometimes they may become aggressive. And of course, there are strategies and techniques that may be used to reduce the risk of aggression during an interview, and we should be familiar with those. They also will see through our attempts often to bluff and they'll also present some pretty convincing claims of innocence because they're lying about a lot of things. They're presenting a story that seems very plausible. And they'll be constantly evaluating us and even interrupting us or disrupting the interview to maintain control of the situation. So there's a variety of things that we can do that might be able to help us, some strategies for countering psychopathic interview behaviors. I want to back up a moment and mention that there may be times when we're interviewing someone and we don't know whether they're a psychopath or not in that regard. And so we have to really be aware of if those characteristics are being presented, but we also have to rule out other scenarios as well, such as the effects of drugs or alcohol, also the effects of other mental disorders. That we may be interviewing someone who's telling us of a violent scenario played out, and it's not related to psychopathy, but it's related maybe to psychosis. If that's the case, that's a whole different story. And in that situation, there's going to be different methods of interviewing. But one of the things that we really want to be sure to do is to become familiar with the case, to learn as much about the case as we can. We also want to present confidence during the interview, and that we have experience conducting interviews. So we're creating a formal interview situation and also presenting our authority, but at the same time we're not worrying about building rapport, and we're not worrying about challenging or degrading or confronting the interviewee in that regard. So we may even show a liking or admiration, and also we may present that we want to learn from them, that they're very smart, they know a lot more about all this than we do, and to go ahead and educate us about the situation. I know when I conducted interviews, I would often say, well, I don't really understand. Can you explain to me? I've had some interviewees say, man, you went to school and you don't know. I said, no, they didn't teach us this in school. I kind of trying to learn this on the way. Well, how long have you been doing this? 10 years. And sometimes, they want to show how smart they are and help they help us through the situation when we ask for their assistance based on feeding into their narcissistic personality style, and so that sometimes can be helpful. I use that a lot, asking them to explain, or I just don't understand. Can you explain? You're the expert here. What would you do? What would you suggest? Where should I look? What should I do? We also want to avoid criticism. I've seen interviews before where the interviewer just comes in and just berates the person. And, if you want to test their impulse control, that's good. And I've seen that done before. Go in a room, try to test impulse control, see when is that person going to get aggressive. You better have 4 or 5 people behind the one-way mirror watching. But you can certainly begin to test their impulse control that way if that's part of the goal. So challenge very cautiously. And also don't expect them to present, feelings about the crimes that were committed or the suffering and harm of others. I mean, I've interviewed people before who actually found great humor in the suffering of others, or great enjoyment, and seemed to be excited about that. So there's all kinds of things that can happen. I mean, I can tell you, once I was interviewing someone and they were talking about another person, another name came up, and they're talking, and I thought that maybe this person, that there were 2 people that were involved in the crime. I asked, well, who's this person who influenced you in a bad way, that started getting you in trouble? I found out that he was talking about his penis. He actually had a name, and he was presenting that anatomical part as if it was another person. And so, I went with that and let him explain, but it kind of threw me because I thought there was actually another person. Not, it's not like he said, it just threw me. And so there's a lot of things that we need to ask for greater explanation. And I found later on that other people had that same pattern, and I'd want to check that out. And again, he explained to me that, as if I was clueless in that regard. In that case, I was. Oh, and we can also look at some of the methods we might use to detect deception. Some are different here, and I always say to be real careful. It reminds me back when I was at a community policing meeting with a lot of citizens, and they were talking about, if you see something suspicious, you should report it. And of course, I was like, well, what do you consider to be suspicious? And they were talking about different things, see that would be out of the ordinary. And this one guy said, well, I can tell if someone is on drugs or mentally ill because they fidget. And I was just sitting there and I thought, oh, yeah. And, you can imagine all of a sudden I just started fidgeting. And then finally I said, I fidget a lot. And he didn't say a word, just kind of looked at me. And I said, I don't know if that necessarily means, that someone's mentally ill or on drugs. Something else might be going on. And the person sitting next to me kind of gave me that look, okay, and started to laugh about the situation. But it's very easy to misread, especially cross-culturally, based on the situation. If someone doesn't maintain eye contact, that doesn't necessarily mean they're guilty of a crime. But we do want to also understand that there's some research out there on psychopathic individuals. And Quayle points out, for example, they may talk quicker or blink more or move their heads more frequently when they're attempting to deceive the interviewer. There's actually some research out there that you can obtain through the online library that demonstrates the differences in speech patterns, language, the way words are used by people with psychopathic personalities. We can also look at the nonverbal behavior, but again, sometimes I really caution on that. What I found is that there's a lot going on, and I try to look at nonverbal behavior, but if I focus too much on nonverbal behavior, then I might lose a little bit about what's going on in the interaction of what's being said. So, I want to be attentive to everything. One thing, in scenarios where you have that ability, you're doing an interview and it's being recorded, or you have a colleague behind a one-way mirror. I once worked at a research center training therapists, and I was doing research basically on marriage and family therapy, and they actually had therapists in the room doing counseling, and they had a little bug in the ear. We called it at that time. This was before Bluetooth and before cell phones. A bug in the ear, and then behind the one-way mirror, the supervisor would say, "Ask him this, ask him that," or and I remember once when the person was just getting too focused on one specific thing. The supervisor started singing, and that distracted, and they got back to trying to look at the big picture. So nonverbal behavior, you can study that in great detail, but it has to really go in with the big picture of things. Look at clues when the suspect you're interviewing is thinking of an answer to a question. That's sometimes helpful, as Quayle points out. And remember that psychopaths will say just about anything to help them achieve their goals. So also I would mention that it's relevant to think about where interviewing a child, adolescent, or adult. What is the particular situation or scenario? Are there cultural factors? I should say there are cultural factors, but what cultural factors are relevant for you to consider And one of the things I recommend is there's some good articles out there on what not to do, where things go totally wrong in an interview with someone with the psychopathic characteristics. Remember, to back up a moment, that we may not know that, some cases we may be handed a case file and you may open that up, and if the person's been through psychiatric evaluation, psychological evaluation, and they have diagnoses, or it's noted in their file that they scored a certain score on the psychopathy checklist, and they are a psychopath, that would be helpful information. We may not have that, and so you have to determine whether or not they have those characteristics when you first meet the person and start interviewing them. That's a lot to ask, because you're kind of being asked to be an investigative interviewer and a psychologist and an attorney and all these things at the same time. So it is very complex. But I would say watch those that have succeeded and see what you can learn from that, carrying that out in interviews, and also watch where things go terribly wrong. Seems like there's a lot of interest in where things go wrong. And for example, there's one article that I have right here that I read by Frank Perry. And again, this is from the Journal of Investigative Psychology and Offender Profiling, which you can obtain all these articles from UCF Library, 2011, volume 8, pages 41 to 57. And Professor Perry has titled his case study, "The Flawed Interview of a Psychopathic Killer, What Went Wrong?" and points out what happened when interviewing techniques that would work probably very well with someone who's not a psychopath went very wrong. So this is just a brief introduction, and really, it can take years to learn how to successfully interview different people involved possibly in different types of crime. I will say I've conducted many interviews, and only once in my career did I have someone curse me out and walk out of the office and slam the door, and that was based on a question that I asked hundreds of times before, but probably was not relevant or appropriate for that particular crime. And my mistake, I apologized and contacted the probation officer, asking that we continue, and that I had probably angered the person with the intrusiveness of my questions. So even someone who, I didn't even think for a moment there, I'd done this type of interview hundreds of times before, and then all of a sudden have a totally different case, and I'm relying on what I had succeeded with before failed. And so I took note of that as well. Always noting what works and what doesn't work in different types of interviews. One thing that would be interesting to see, I don't know if there's research on this or not, but if you have someone who has, fairly moderate psychopathy characteristics, and they're the actual interviewer, and they're interviewing a psychopath who has similar or more intense characteristics of the psychopath. In other words, what happens when a psychopath interviews a psychopath? Are they better? I don't know. I don't even know why I thought of that question. Anyway, I post a couple of articles for you in the PowerPoint in our web course, and if you're watching this, also the FBI on their website has an excellent article out, I believe by Professor O'Toole, and some of her colleagues on interviewing psychopaths, and you can do or a Google search on that and get that from the FBI. And this wraps up this video.